d4. Queen's pawn opening, opening line. The queen's pawn opening move is somewhat slower than the popular e4 because white will not be able to castle for 3 more moves. Its advantage is that it gives white more control over tactical surprises and often provides more lasting initiative and pressure. Knight f6. Indian defense, opening line. The immediate development of the knight is the most supple response to the queen's pawn opening, allowing transposition into virtually every type of defense at black's disposal. Knight f3. Indian defense, Tory attack, opening line. The Tory attack is characterized by white's second and third moves, knight f3 and bishop g5. White avoids several defenses that would be possible after 2c4 and prepares a kingside attack along the lines of the collie opening. g6. Indian defense, Tory attack, pseudo-king's Indian, opening line. This is one of several common ways to enter the king's Indian defense posture for black. Yet to be decided are the related defenses, the Yugoslav variation, levering the center with c5, or Benoni defense, or Grunfeld defense. Bishop g5. Indian defense, Tory attack, pseudo-king's Indian, Tory attack, opening line. Bishop g7. Out of opening book. Enables the short castle. Knight b d2. Castle kingside. e4. d5. E takes d5. Knight takes d5. Blocks white's pawn at d4. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. c3. h6. Attacks white's bishop at g5. Bishop h4. Moves it to safety. c5. D takes c5. White wins a pawn. White is up a pawn. Knight f4. Bishop g3. Attacks black's knight at f4. Queen c7. Removes the threat on black's knight at f4 and attacks white's pawn at c5. Bishop takes f4. Attacks black's queen. Queen takes f4. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Bishop c4. Pins black's pawn at f7 and clears the way for a kingside castle. Knight d7. Threatens white's pawn at c5. Queen e2. Threatens black's pawn at e7 and clears the way for a queenside castle. e6. Moves it out of harm's way and frees black's pawn at f7 from the pin. Knight b3. Removes the threat on white's pawn at c5. Queen c7. Castle kingside. Knight takes c5. Knight takes c5. Queen takes c5. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a knight. Material is even. Rook a d1. Seizes the open file. a6. Rook F E1. B5. Attacks White's bishop. Bishop D3. Moves it to safety. Rook A7. Bishop E4. Rook C7. Knight D4. Queen B6. Knight C2. King H7. G3. Rook D7. Rook takes D7. Bishop takes D7. Black wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Rook D1. Attacks Black's bishop at D7. Bishop C8. Moves it to safety. Queen E3. Frees White's pawn at F2 from the pin and threatens Black's queen. Queen C7. Moves it to safety. Queen D3. F5. Frees Black's pawn at G6 from the pin and attacks White's bishop. Bishop G2. Moves it to safety. Bishop F6. Queen D6. Forks Black's rook and Black's queen. Rook F7. Moves it to safety and removes the threat on Black's queen. Knight B4. Blocks Black's pawn at B5. Rook D7. Skewers White's queen and threatens White's queen. Queen takes C7. Pins Black's rook with a partial pin and threatens Black's bishop at C8. Rook takes C7. Protects Black's bishop at C8. Black wins a queen for a queen. Material is even. Rook D6. Pins Black's pawn at E6. Bishop E7. Frees Black's pawn at E6 from the pin and threatens White's rook. Rook C6. Moves it out of harm's way, skewers Black's rook and threatens Black's rook. Rook takes C6. Knight takes C6. Threatens Black's bishop at E7. White wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Bishop C5. Moves it to safety and pins White's pawn at F2. B4. Attacks Black's bishop at C5. Bishop B6. Moves it to safety. Knight E7. Attacks Black's bishop at C8. Bishop D7. Moves it to safety. Bishop B7. Attacks Black's pawn at A6. A5. Moves it out of harm's way. Bishop C8. Threatens Black's bishop at D7. A takes B4. Attacks White's pawn at C3 and isolates White's pawn at C3 and White's pawn at A2. C takes B4. Bishop D8. Slightly better is Bishop E8. Evaluating. The chessmaster recommends bishop to E8. You move your bishop to E8, which moves it to safety. White responds with bishop captures pawn. You move your bishop to D4. White answers with knight to D5. You move your bishop to E5. White replies by moving pawn to F4, which threatens your bishop at E5. You move your bishop to D4, which moves it to safety and checks White's king. White counters by moving the king to F1, which moves it out of check. You move your bishop to C6. White counters by moving the king to E2. You move your king to G7. White responds by moving the king to D3, which threatens your bishop at D4. Your bishop takes knight, which attacks White's bishop. White answers with bishop takes bishop. You move your bishop to G1, which moves it to safety and attacks White's pawn at H2. White responds by moving pawn to H3, which moves it to safety. You move your king to F6. As a result of this sequence of moves, the pressure on White's king is slightly increased. Bishop D8. Slightly better is bishop E8. Bishop takes D7. Forks Black's pawn at E6 and Black's pawn at B5. Bishop takes E7. Threatens White's pawn at B4. Bishop takes E6. Slightly better is A3. Analyzing. The chessmaster recommends pawn to A3. You move your pawn to A3, which removes the threat on your pawn at B4. Black replies by moving the king to G7. Your bishop takes pawn at B5, which creates passed pawns on B4 and A3. Black replies by moving king to F6. You move your king to F1. Black responds by moving pawn to E5. You move your king to E2. Black responds with the pawn to E4. You move your pawn to H4. Black replies by moving bishop to D6. You move your bishop to E8. Black responds by moving pawn to G5. Your pawn takes pawn, which forks Black's king and Black's pawn at H6 and isolates Black's pawn at H6. Black counters with pawn, captures pawn, which removes the threat on Black's king. You move your bishop to C6. Black replies by moving king to E5. You move your king to E3, which blocks Black's pawn at E4. As a result of this line of play, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. Additionally, your mobility is somewhat increased. Also, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved. Lastly, the pressure on Black's king is somewhat increased. Bishop takes E6. Slightly better is A3. Bishop takes b4. Isolates White's pawn at a2. Black wins a knight and 2 pawns for a bishop and 2 pawns. Material is even. Bishop d7 threatens Black's pawn at b5. King g7. Bishop takes b5. Creates a passed pawn on a2. White wins a pawn. White is ahead by a pawn. Bishop a3 blocks White's pawn at a2. King f1. King f6. King e2. g5. f4. G takes f4. G takes f4. White wins a pawn for a pawn. White. Bishop d6 threatens White's pawn at f4. King f3 protects White's pawn at f4. Bishop a3 blocks White's pawn at a2. Bishop d7. King g6. The game ends in a draw. Diagnosing. The chessmaster recommends pawn to h4. You move your pawn to h4. Black counters with king to f6. You move your pawn to h5. Black counters with the bishop to b4. You move your pawn to a4, which pushes the passed pawn. Black replies by moving bishop to a5, which blocks your pawn at a4. You move your king to e3. Black responds by moving bishop to b6, which checks your king. You move your king to e2, which moves it out of check. Black responds with the bishop to c7, which threatens your pawn at f4. You move your bishop to c6. Black counters with king to e6. You move your bishop to b7. Black responds by moving the bishop to b6. You move your king to d3. Black responds with the bishop to c7, which attacks your pawn at f4. You move your king to e3, which protects your pawn at f4. As a result of this sequence of moves, your attack potential is slightly increased, and the mobility of Black's pieces is slightly decreased. Additionally, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved. King g6. The game ends in a draw.